Are you looking for a cozy and stylish hoodie for the holiday season? Well, this hoodie cape is the perfect blend of warmth and flair. Hi, I'm Christina, and I love to digitally pattern draft, creating unique pieces of wearable art. And today I am super excited to be creating a one-of-a-kind hoodie cape. This cape is a fusion of casual comfort and a hoodie with a dramatic flow of a cape. So, whether you are wrapping gifts at home or heading out for some holiday fun, this piece will add a dash of magic to your outfit. Join me as we walk through the steps to sew this comfy and unique design, and make sure to grab the pattern down below. Let's head on over to the projector. I'm going to start by pulling up my pattern in Illustrator, and I'm going to resize it so that I know it's projecting the correct size. I always like to then double check by pulling up my grid and just making sure it matches my grid on my mat and everything is lined up. This just makes sure that I'm cutting out the correct size of my pattern. Once I am happy that it matches up with my grid and I know I am on the right size, I'm going to move over to my pattern and lay out my fabric. Now, since this is a pattern, I want to make sure that when I'm cutting on the double, the patterns are matching top to bottom. A lot of times when I cut out patterns like this, I will actually cut out a single layer at a time and then flip it over and match the pattern. But I think I'll be able to. This pattern is pretty similar side to side and top to bottom, so I just was very careful, matched it up before I started cutting out. Then I'm going to first cut out my hood, and then I'm going to cut out my center front. And I got a little too excited when I was cutting everything out, and then I immediately cut out the side front without checking the pattern matching, which I knew I'd have to move, and I forgot to move it. So I'm just going to have to deal with my front seam to the side front seam not being pattern matched. So if you want to make sure that you are pattern matching, make sure you pay attention before you get too happy cutting. Next, you're going to want to make sure that you mark out all your notches so that you know where everything is going to want to lay. You want to do this before you move your pattern ideally, but if you forget, you can always replace your pattern down and remark everything. Next, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the pocket. So I'm going to first be placing my little facing of the pocket, or the pocket binding. I want to change it up and I want to put it on the diagonal. So I'm going to start by putting it there and cutting it out. Then I want to cut out my main pocket. Now I do want to match this up with the center front of my hoodie capelet. So I'm going to leave my pattern down, see how it's matching up, and eyeball it to match up the patterns. And I always like to do a double check by placing it on top and making sure it looks good. Now we're going to move on to cutting out the center back. So I am going to go ahead and line this up. And now I am going to still try to do a little bit of pattern matching. Even though it's not going to fully work, I still want to pay attention to it. So I'm going to make sure that the patterns kind of go all the way around. They'll match from the center front a little bit, and then specifically that side seam. Once I have the patterns good, I'm going to cut it out, mark my notches, and then I'm going to move on to the hem binding that I have here. So I need to cut out 2 of these really long pieces, and as I'm looking to cut it out, I'm just kind of debating on what part of the pattern do I want seen, what part do I not want to see, and just how will it work. So it's the one thing about the projector. It's really easy to see what's going to be happening with these patterns. And now that they're all cut out, it is time to move over to the serger. I'm going to start by serging my back pieces, my side front pieces, my center front pieces, my binding pieces, or my long hem binding piece, and my hood. I'm not going to serge my pocket yet because I actually want to put the binding on the pocket opening before I serge it. So I'm just serging all around all the pieces except the pocket. And I definitely need a new anti-moving mat for my serger. Now it's time to finish the pocket. So I'm going to fold my binding in half, line it up with one edge, move back to my serger, and I'm just going to serge it on, stretching it just a little bit so that it keeps that pocket nice and tight. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side, line it up with fold it in half, line it up with the one side, and then serge it on. Now, you do want to finish all the sides of your pocket by either serging around. However, if you want to have the serged edge between the pocket and the binding stitched down, you want to stitch it down either with a sewing machine or a cover stitch before you serge around the rest of the pieces to finish it off. That way, the seam allowance will always lay to one side. And then once you are happy with how that's going to lay, then I do recommend serging all the way around that piece to make sure it is nice and finished on the inside. Now it's time to actually place the pocket onto the center front. So I'm just going to fold down the seam allowance and also make sure I'm lining up that pattern. I am so happy that this actually pattern matched. The other thing I'm going to do in this step is I'm actually going to sew my side front seam at the same time. I'm now going to pin my center front to my side front seam. Now I know that the pattern will not match up for this one because I got a little bit too happy when I was cutting, but I do still want to pin it well, make sure it's going to go good. And then I'm also going to give myself perpendicular pins at the sleeve openings. So if you don't want to have sleeve openings, you can just sew top to bottom. But if you want to have your sleeve openings, I always suggest marking it either with your chalk pen or something, or I like to just mark it with my pins so I know that's where I need to stop. Now, I do like to prep a lot of stuff before I move back to the sewing machine, so I've prepped the other side, and now I'm going to prep my hood as well. So I'm just going to line up, make sure the pattern matching looks good, and pin my hood together. Now I can sit down at my sewing machine and sew a whole bunch. So I'm going to sew my hood first at that 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around, back stitching at the beginning and in. Next, I'm going to sew my center back seam from bottom to top. Make sure I am back stitching at the bottom and at the top. And then I'm going to sew my center front to my side front. I'm going to back stitch at the bottom, move up to my first perpendicular pin, back stitch. Then I'm just going to move across that armhole opening, start by back stitching again and finishing up the seam. And now it's finally time to actually top stitch on the pocket. You want to make sure that you're not catching anything below, and then you're just going to top stitch around the pocket. And finally securing the top of the pocket. There we go. Now it is time to repeat it on the other side. I'm going to start by doing the center front to side front seam, back stitching at the bottom and at each end of the arm opening. And then I'm going to top stitch on the pocket. There we go. Next it is time to sew my two side facings together. Awesome. Now we're going to move over to the ironing board and iron everything. I'm going to start with that front to side front side seam. You are going to be ironing over a part that does not have it stitched. So you want to make sure that you are keeping that as even as possible. Next, we're going to be ironing the hood. So I'm going to first start by pressing open the seam. This will help it lay nice and flat and make it look nice and crisp at the end. Once I get to that curve, it's better if you have a ham. I did not have a ham on me, but I do recommend using a ham. Next, I'm going to press the facing back. So I'm pressing back a 1/4 of an inch to start, and then I'm going to press back a full inch. Now, as I'm pressing this back, I'm just using the pattern on the actual fabric to kind of help give me a guideline. And then as I press it, I'm going to go ahead and throw some pins in it at the same time. That way it stays as I finish pressing everything else. And if I don't get to this first thing, I can then still have it prepped and ready to go. There we go. Next, I'm going to press again the other center front to side front. Again, make sure that you are not either giving too much or too little seam allowance at the opening. And now it's time to move on to the center back. So I'm going to go ahead and press that open. And finally, I'm going to press open the center back seam of the facing. Now we're going to head back over to our sewing machines, and I'm going to start by stitching down the facing of my hood to make sure it stays down. Oh, and I ran out of thread. So we're going to have to replace my bobbin, pull the thread back up, and continue from where my thread left off. I definitely, sadly, lost bobbin roulette this time. Then we're going to stitch around our sleeve openings. This will hold the seam allowance back and give it a nice crisp look around those armhole openings. So I'm going to do that on both sides. I like to just use the edge of my presser foot as a guide, but it can be any depth you choose. There we have it. Now it is time to sew up our side seams. So we're going to be sewing our center backs to our front pieces, and we're going to match up the pattern as best we can. There we go. There's the one side. Now it's time to do the other side. Again, I'm making sure I am just keeping that pattern going nicely all the way around. Again, I did not do the best job of pattern matching when I was cutting, so always ensure you, that is the most important part of pattern matching, is when you are cutting. And, you know, sometimes you just forget. There we have it. Now I'm going to run some basting stitches on the bottom part of my hood so that it will easily gather into my neckline. I always like to run 2 lines of gathering stitches because it will gather more evenly. Then I'm going to line up my hood and cape. So I'm going to fold back my zipper allowance I'm going to have for my closure at the center front, and then I'm going to line up the center back of my hood and the center front of my hood, pull those gathering stitches, and even out the gathers from the center back to the center front on both sides. This will ensure that you have a nice even gather for your hood. Then we're going to sew the hood on. We're just going to work slowly over those pins, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and end. Now it's time to sew the facing. So I'm going to start by just getting both ends of my facing, and I'm going to sew my 5/8 inch seam allowance in so that it is a nice finished edge. Then I'm going to fold my facing in half and line it up with the hem of the hoodie cape. So I'm going to line up the center back and I'm going to line up the center front, and it should nicely fit in all across there. Once it's all pinned on, I'm going to go ahead and sew the facing onto the top part of the cape. Now, you can do a second row of stitching once it's on one side. You can then flip that seam allowance up and give it another either straight stitch with your sewing machine or a cover stitch to really contain that seam allowance and make sure that it always is folded up. This is what will sometimes really make the differences between making something that just kind of looks put together and something that looks fully finished. Now it's time to actually add that closure. So I'm using a zipper. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my zipper on, lining up the bottom part of the zipper to the bottom part of the hoodie cape. And then I'm just going to pin up. Now I'm going to be pinning on the right side of the fabric, even though I will be sewing opposite and I will have to move my pins because I am wanting to fully make sure all my pattern matching looks really good, specifically up that center line. I'm going to do everything from the front side first, and then I will transfer it over to the back. That way everything's good. You can do it by actually basting it shut, making sure everything's good, and then opening up that basting. They both take probably about the same amount of time. I chose not to get up the basting just because sometimes pulling basting out of polar fleece like this is not my favorite. So I rather just use a whole bunch of pins and get it lined up perfectly. There we go. Once I have it all pinned and I am happy with the pattern matching from the front, I'm going to go ahead and flip my pins to the back and then move over to my sewing machine and stitch on that zipper. Now this is thick enough fabric that, and I am doing a seam that's far enough away, I didn't need to change to my zipper foot. I sometimes find on really thick fabric, zipper foots, specifically for this Kenmore, are not super, super happy. So when I can use my regular foot, just put my needle all the way over to one edge. And so it always works out a little better. Then once you have the zipper fully on there, you are done and ready to try it on. You can put a hook right at the top if you so choose. I am not going to do the hook this time. I'm just going to go ahead and try it on. And oh, I love it so much. I'm super excited how warm and cozy this cute hoodie cape will be this winter. And there we have it. I am super excited to be wearing this fun new hoodie cape around the house, whether it's to sit down and read a good book or if it's going to be cooking some magical cookies for the holiday season. Remember, if you enjoyed this video and want this pattern, you can find it down below. And if you also enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. That way you can see other fun ways to either digitally draft some fun patterns or create some unique pieces of wearable art. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy sewing!